In the ancient world, some civilizations seemed to know far more than they should have. They mapped the skies, tracked the earth, and built systems modern science still struggles to explain. So what exactly did they know? And where did that knowledge come from? Top 1. The Sumerian Planetary Code. It begins with a piece of clay that never should have known so much. In 1889, during excavations in an ancient Sumerian city near modern-day Baghdad, archaeologists uncovered a tablet covered in dense, carefully arranged symbols. At first, it looked like countless other fragments pulled from Mesopotamian ruins. Another administrative record, another remnant of a civilization already famous for writing, trade, and law. But when later translators took a closer look, the meaning appeared far more unsettling. This was not a list of grain, taxes, or temple inventories. According to the interpretation that followed, the tablet seemed to describe the solar system itself. What made the claim so extraordinary was not just that planets were listed, it was the level of detail. The system was said to include worlds that, by conventional history, should have remained invisible to the naked eye for thousands of years. Uranus, Neptune, even Pluto. More than that, the planets were allegedly arranged in their relative order from the Sun and tied to a mathematical framework based on the Sumerian Base 60 system. That alone would be enough to trigger controversy. But the deeper researchers went, the stranger it became. The artifact, often associated with catalog references such as K8538 in later discussions, was said to include descriptions of planetary rotations, orbital behavior, and celestial alignments in a way that appeared disturbingly precise. For a Bronze Age civilization with no telescopes, no observatory lenses, and no accepted technology for deep space viewing, the implications were enormous. How could people separated from modern astronomy by 4,000 years describe planetary bodies so distant that later civilizations would need advanced instruments just to confirm they existed? And then there was the most controversial detail of all, the reference to a 12th body, sometimes linked in fringe interpretations to Nibiru, a planet described as moving in a highly elliptical orbit and returning only after vast stretches of time. Whether one accepts that interpretation or not, the larger mystery remains the same. Why would ancient Sumerian records present the heavens as something structured, ordered, and mathematically knowable at a level far beyond what mainstream history says was possible? This is where the story shifts from curiosity into something more disturbing. The Sumerians did not present this knowledge as an invention of their own. In their mythology, wisdom came from higher beings, the Anunnaki, entities connected to the heavens who were said to have passed knowledge down to humanity. Mainstream historians dismiss that language as symbolism, religious imagination, or poetic cosmology. And in many cases, that is a reasonable response. But symbols do not usually resemble technical systems. Myths do not typically organize celestial bodies with mathematical consistency unless they are preserving something more than metaphor. What makes the case even more suspicious is the pattern of disappearance surrounding related materials. Over time, reports emerged that accompanying fragments tied to lunar cycles and star charts vanished from museum access. Researchers pushing more aggressive interpretations found their work marginalized. Rumors circulated that certain pieces had been locked away, restricted, or quietly removed from broader public examination. Whether exaggerated or not, that atmosphere of silence only added to the mystery. So we are left with an uncomfortable possibility. Either later interpreters projected modern astronomy onto ancient symbols and built a legend from ambiguity, or the Sumerians preserved a fragment of knowledge that does not fit the official timeline of human development. And if that second possibility is even partly true, then the question becomes much more dangerous than the tablet itself. Were the Sumerians imagining the cosmos or remembering it? Top 2. The Vedic science of the atom and the cosmos. Some of the strangest scientific ideas in history may not have come from a laboratory at all. In 1903, a British linguist examining ancient Sanskrit material reportedly found passages that seemed almost impossible to place in their historical context. Buried within the Vaisheshika tradition were descriptions of matter broken down into units so small they could no longer be divided. These were not framed as casual metaphors or poetic fragments. They appeared as part of an organized attempt to explain matter, motion, and the structure of reality itself. The key concept was anu, an indivisible particle that could combine in different ways to create the visible world. For a text tradition dated many centuries before modern physics, that alone would have been enough to raise eyebrows. But it did not stop there. The same body of material also described forces of attraction and repulsion, along with a universe held together by unseen energies. In some passages, creation was imagined as a kind of radiant origin point, a golden womb spinning outward and spreading the material universe. To modern ears, those descriptions sound eerily close to later ideas about atomic behavior, vibration, and even the expansion of the cosmos. Of course, historians can argue that resemblance does not equal evidence. They can say these were philosophical intuitions, not scientific formulas. And yet what makes this case so unsettling is the level of structure. These were not isolated mystical statements. They formed a recurring pattern across multiple traditions, as though some older system of knowledge had been preserved and transmitted over time. Then the mystery takes a far more controversial turn. Across Vedic and post-Vedic literature, there are repeated references to Vimanas, flying machines described with a level of detail that sounds less like mythology and more like technical memory. One especially striking example, presented in later writings built on earlier traditions, describes vehicles with a central Mercury engine, heated gyroscopic propulsion, vertical lift, steering control, and even forms of concealment. Whether one believes these accounts literally or not, the language is difficult to ignore. It does not read like a simple myth about winged chariots in the sky. It reads, at least in the transcript's framing, like a blueprint broken into symbolic language. That is where the story becomes even darker. According to the transcript, attempts were reportedly made to recreate some of these designs, and under certain conditions, rotating Mercury systems were said to generate unusual lift effects in high electromagnetic environments. There are also claims that parts of ancient Vimana manuscripts were classified, and that later aerospace-linked efforts tried to study or reverse engineer them without publicly releasing results. Whether those claims are exaggerated, misunderstood, or deliberately buried, they feed the same unsettling question that hangs over the entire chapter. How could a civilization from such a remote era describe both subatomic-like principles and advanced aerial machinery in the same intellectual tradition? And this is the transition that matters most. Once you move past the easy dismissal of myth, what remains is a system too consistent to feel random. Across centuries, the same ideas appear again: atomic vibration, celestial order, engineered flight, hidden forces. Either later readers are imposing modern meaning onto ancient texts, or those texts preserve fragments of knowledge that were never supposed to survive into the present. If the sages of ancient India were not inventing these ideas, but inheriting them, then what exactly was passed down to them, and who first understood it? Top 3. The Dogon Sirius Secret. Few stories in ancient history are as unsettling as a people with no modern instruments describing a star they should never have been able to see. In 1931, French anthropologists Marcel Griol and Germaine Dieterlen began a long ethnographic study among the Dogon of Mali, a community living along the cliffs of the Bandiagara escarpment. What they expected to find was a rich spiritual tradition, a cosmology shaped by ritual, memory, and oral inheritance. What they did not expect was a body of astronomical knowledge that appeared wildly out of place. According to the transcript, Dogon elders described Sirius not as a single bright star, but as a system with an invisible companion, an unseen body they called Potolo. That detail alone would have been remarkable, but it was the precision surrounding it that made the story so difficult to dismiss. The Dogon described this hidden companion as extraordinarily dense, the heaviest thing in the universe associated with a special matter that no sea could penetrate. Even more striking, they reportedly said it orbited Sirius A once every 50 years. That is the number that sent shockwaves through later retellings of the story, because Sirius B, the white dwarf companion to Sirius, was only discovered by Western astronomy in the 19th century, and its orbital cycle required telescopic science to confirm. Yet here, in an isolated oral tradition, was a matching time frame preserved in ritual language and sacred teaching. Not just that, But the Dogon were also said to describe the orbit as elliptical, to refer to complex celestial motion, and even to mention a third star in the system. On its own, one surprising detail might be explained away as coincidence, but the larger cosmology made the case harder to ignore. The Dogon tradition, as presented in the transcript, also included ideas about planets rotating on axes, a spiral-like view of the Milky Way, and a structured model of the heavens that seemed far beyond what a non-technological society should have acquired through ordinary naked-eye observation. Skeptics have long argued that such knowledge could have entered the culture through European contact. That is the standard explanation, and in some ways the safest one. But the troubling claim in the transcript is that these teachings were already embedded in Dogon religious life before meaningful modern exposure could account for them. And then, like so many mysteries in this script, the story takes on the scent of suppression. Field notes, photographs, and early expedition materials reportedly became harder to trace. Later researchers who questioned the standard dismissal found support evaporating. A documentary effort in the 1980s was allegedly shelved. Whether these disappearances were sinister or simply the result of academic drift, the effect is the same. The clearer the questions became, the harder the evidence seemed to pin down. That uncertainty created space for an even more radical layer of the story. The Dogon belief that their knowledge came from beings called the Nomo, amphibious teachers who descended from the sky in a spinning vessel, brought wisdom, then returned to the stars. Cave imagery and ritual symbolism deepened that mythology, blurring the line between cosmic memory and sacred allegory. This is the tension at the heart of the Dogon mystery. Either an isolated oral culture somehow preserved highly specific astronomical concepts through means we still do not fully understand, or later interpreters, hungry for marvels, stitched modern science into traditional belief. But if the Dogon really did remember something about Sirius that should have been invisible to them, then the real mystery is no longer the star itself. Who taught them to look into the sky as if they had already been there? Top 4. The Olmecs and the Magnetized Heads. The stone heads of the Olmecs may have been doing more than staring back at the world. In 1862, in the tropical lowlands of Veracruz, Mexico, a farmer clearing land uncovered something enormous rising from the soil. A colossal carved head, partially buried, weighing more than 20 tons and standing nearly 7 feet tall. It would become the first of 17 massive heads linked to the Olmec civilization, a culture that flourished more than 3,000 years ago and left behind no fully readable written history. For decades, the mystery centered on their scale, their craftsmanship, and the faces themselves. But later, according to the transcript, researchers noticed something even stranger. The stone was not only carved, it was magnetic. When scientists examined the heads, they reportedly found unusual magnetic anomalies across their surfaces. In some areas, compasses would spin. In others, they would seem to freeze or behave unpredictably. The stone, largely basalt, contained naturally magnetized iron-rich material. That alone would have been interesting. But what made the discovery unsettling was the placement. The magnetic poles were not scattered randomly through the sculpture. They appeared concentrated around specific facial features, the temples, the cheeks, even the tip of the nose. According to the transcript, the alignment was so precise that researchers found it difficult to dismiss as accident. That changes the entire meaning of these monuments. If the magnetic properties were intentional, then the Olmecs were not simply carving giant ceremonial heads. They were selecting specific stone, understanding its invisible behavior, and embedding that force into the design of the monument itself. In other words, these sculptures may have functioned as more than art. They may have been markers, instruments, or objects meant to interact with the Earth's geomagnetic field. And that possibility becomes even harder to ignore when placed against the accepted historical timeline. The earliest well-known magnetic compass traditions emerged much later. Yet here is a Mesoamerican civilization, supposedly working in a pre-Iron Age context, appearing to choose and orient magnetic stone with striking accuracy. This is the transition that makes the mystery truly uncomfortable. Once the heads are treated as engineered objects instead of symbolic ones, the Olmecs no longer look like a culture working at the edge of primitive monument building. They begin to look like a civilization experimenting with invisible natural forces. The transcript even points to selective basalt extraction in areas rich in magnetic ore, suggesting that the raw material itself may have been chosen with purpose. It also references legends of celestial sky brothers who taught the people how to track stars and feel the pull of the earth, a myth that becomes much harder to ignore once magnetism enters the picture. Then, as in so many of these cases, there is the pattern of silence. Reports tied to magnetic mapping were said to be withdrawn. Museum labels removed the anomaly. Public-facing exhibits stopped mentioning the most provocative detail. Whether that was caution, embarrassment, or suppression, the result was the same. The strangest part of the story slipped back into the shadows. So if these heads were not just monuments, but deliberate interactions with Earth's magnetic field, then what exactly were the Olmecs trying to build? And what else did they know about forces we still pretend they could not understand? Top 5. The Incas and the Knotted Code. The Incas may have built one of the most advanced information systems in the ancient world without ever writing a single word. In 1923, high in the Peruvian Andes, archaeologists uncovered a cache of intricately knotted cords sealed inside a chamber near the ruins of Choqquequirao. At first glance, the objects looked simple, almost deceptively so. Bundles of strings, colored cords, hanging strands tied in patterns that seemed decorative or, at best, administrative. For years, that was largely how they were treated: primitive accounting tools, records of grain, labor, or census totals. But as researchers studied them more closely, that explanation began to collapse. These cords, known as quipus, appeared to contain something far more complex, a structured system of encoded information that modern scholars still cannot fully decipher. A single quipu could include dozens of pendant cords, each varying in color, twist direction, knot type, placement, and orientation. None of those features seem random. According to the transcript, later research suggested that these elements work together as layers of information, almost like a multi-dimensional code. Some Harvard-based studies even proposed that certain quipus resembled binary logic, with different knot forms functioning like bits in a larger information system. That is what makes the Inca case so unsettling. This was not just memory aid or bookkeeping. It may have been a full data architecture, portable, scalable, and standardized across an empire stretching more than 2,500 miles through some of the harshest terrain on Earth. And that changes everything. Because once quipus are understood as more than number strings, the Inca world begins to look very different. Here was a civilization with no conventional written alphabet, yet it managed roads, taxation, logistics, labor distribution, religious authority, and population control on a scale rivaling the great empires of antiquity. Goods moved across mountains rising above 15,000 feet. Orders were transmitted, records were preserved, administrators governed. Somehow the empire functioned through cords, knots, trained interpreters, and a system that may have stored not only quantities, but stories, laws, places, and events. Some researchers even suggested that quipus may have preserved non-numerical narrative content, possibly entire histories. If true, then these were not simple records. They were an archive woven in fiber. The tragedy is that much of that archive was deliberately destroyed. When the Spanish arrived, vast numbers of quipus were burned, buried, or confiscated. Missionaries viewed them as pagan tools and possible threats, especially if they preserved indigenous knowledge beyond colonial control. The specialists able to read them, the quipucamayocs, were hunted, silenced, or forced to abandon their skill. Within a generation, the code was effectively broken. What remained were fragments without a fluent living tradition to unlock them. In recent years, AI and statistical modeling have produced partial breakthroughs, revealing patterns tied to place, time, and event structure. But the full grammar remains locked away, protected by silence, destruction, and the strange resilience of a medium that carries meaning without letters. So the real mystery is no longer whether the Incas had a communication system. They clearly did. The mystery is what that system was truly capable of storing, and what was erased when the cords were burned. If even one surviving quipu contains a lost history written in knots, Then how much of the Inca world are we still unable to read because the language was never forgotten by accident, but destroyed on purpose? Top 6. The Nabateans' Water Engineering Mastery. In one of the driest landscapes on Earth, an ancient civilization somehow learned how to make the desert obey. In 1997, satellite imagery of southern Jordan revealed something that forced researchers to look at Petra in an entirely different way. For generations, Petra had been admired for its monumental facades, its rose-red cliffs, and the astonishing visual drama of a city carved directly into stone. But the real miracle of Petra may not have stood above ground at all. It may have been hidden beneath the sand, inside the rock, and along the canyon walls in a water system so precise that even modern engineers struggle to explain how it was built with the tools the Nabateans were supposedly limited to. According to the transcript, archaeologists and hydrologists studying the region uncovered a sprawling network of canals, reservoirs, ceramic pipes, and subterranean channels converging on the city. An entire hydraulic machine operating in the middle of a near-waterless desert. That alone would have been impressive. But what made the discovery so disturbing was the accuracy. The channels were not rough trenches cut into rock. They were engineered with remarkable mathematical consistency, sloped with an accuracy said to fall within less than a quarter inch per foot. Some tunnels stretched for more than 10 miles, guiding rainfall from distant mountains into the center of Petra. Hidden behind carved stone walls were cisterns, overflow systems, sediment control chambers, and pressure-regulating features designed not only to collect water, but to manage it intelligently. This was not a civilization improvising survival. This was a civilization mastering hydrology, and that is the transition that changes the story completely. Once you stop seeing Petra as just a city of tombs and facades and start seeing it as a desert-scale engineering system, the Nabateans begin to look less like caravan traders and more like specialists in environmental control. They did not merely store water. They predicted its movement, softened the violence of seasonal floods, prevented sediment buildup, and maintained stable access through drought conditions that should have made long-term urban life nearly impossible. One reservoir reportedly held more than 20,000 gallons, sealed with a hydraulic cement whose erosion resistance has been compared to far later engineering traditions. Even more unsettling, some of the system's geometric placements suggest a degree of surveying and topographic planning far beyond what historians typically assign to a semi-nomadic desert kingdom. The mystery deepens when you ask the most basic question of all. How did they learn to do this? The Nabateans left no large technical manuals explaining their methods. No complete written engineering doctrine survives. Their knowledge appears to have been transmitted through practice, memory, and tradition. Yet some of the conduits follow cliff faces with such confidence that researchers have wondered whether they use lost methods of slope measurement, shadow tracking, or reflective devices to calculate elevation and flow. The transcript even mentions local legends about whispering rocks and polished sky mirrors used to guide water, ideas that sound mythical on the surface, but begin to feel more provocative once placed beside the infrastructure itself. In one canyon, the curve of a channel is described as following a logarithmic spiral, a shape associated more with advanced mathematical design than ancient desert construction. And then comes the familiar pattern. Parts of the underground system remain sealed, unexplored, or restricted. Large-scale scanning requests have reportedly been limited. Subterranean sections are still hidden. What lies beneath Petra may be far more extensive than the public ever sees. That uncertainty leaves a dangerous possibility hanging in the air. If the Nabateans truly built a water network this advanced in one of the harshest climates on the planet, then perhaps the real lost technology is not some machine of metal and gears, but knowledge of landscape, mathematics, and survival so advanced that modern history has never fully known where to place it. So if Petra was not just a city, but a precision-built hydraulic organism hidden inside the desert, then what else did the Nabateans understand about nature that we have only just begun to rediscover? Top 7. The Ancient Egyptians and Brain Surgery. Long before modern medicine claimed the brain as its territory, someone in ancient Egypt may have already been operating on it. In 1860, while cataloging skeletal remains in what the transcript calls the Necropolis of Thieves, British archaeologists came across a human skull bearing a perfectly circular opening carved into the parietal bone. This was no battlefield wound and no random fracture. The edges showed signs of healing, which meant the individual had survived the procedure. That single discovery would have been remarkable on its own. But over the following decades, more than 50 similar skulls were reportedly found across Egypt, each showing evidence of deliberate cranial intervention and each pushing the timeline of neurological surgery thousands of years deeper into the past. What made these cases so disturbing was not just their age, but their precision. According to the transcript, the incisions were careful, controlled, and anatomically aware. They avoided major blood vessels. They penetrated bone without descending recklessly into catastrophic damage. In some cases, the openings aligned with areas that modern medicine would recognize as relevant to relieving intracranial pressure after trauma. That is the transition that changes this story completely. Once these skulls are viewed not as ritual mutilation, but as targeted intervention, ancient Egyptian medicine begins to look less like primitive healing and more like an early surgical science built on observation, anatomy, and repeated practice. Modern neurosurgeons who examined the remains reportedly concluded that the techniques reflected a functional understanding of the brain and its relationship to the skull. Then came the most chilling detail of all. In 2007, CT scans of a mummy in the Cairo Museum reportedly revealed internal signs of surgical access deeper inside the head. A delicate cut had been made behind the orbital socket and into the skull base, suggesting possible access toward the pituitary region. If that interpretation is correct, then this was not only cranial drilling, it was highly targeted anatomical work at a level that should have been unimaginable for a civilization so ancient. And that becomes even harder to dismiss when placed beside the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, which the transcript describes as containing case-based medical analysis of head injuries, paralysis, prognosis, and treatment logic that resembles triage more than superstition. Some entries reportedly connect specific areas of trauma to blindness, speech loss, or seizures. Most striking of all, the text approaches these cases through method and observation, not magic. And yet this knowledge did not survive intact. According to the transcript, after the decline of the pharaonic dynasties and the rise of Greco-Roman dominance, Egyptian medical knowledge was absorbed, altered, and gradually suppressed. Surgical instruments that remained were dismissed as ceremonial. Radiological access to mummies was resisted. References to cranial intervention were softened or omitted. Even later research highlighting survival rates and sophistication reportedly met quiet resistance. Whether all of that was deliberate censorship or simply institutional discomfort, the result was the same. A tradition that may once have understood the brain through direct practice vanished into fragments. So if ancient Egyptian healers could open the skull with precision, understand the consequences of trauma, and possibly target structures deep within the head, then we are left with a far more unsettling question than whether they performed surgery at all. How much of early medical history has been lost because we assumed the ancients were incapable of knowing what their surviving evidence now seems to suggest? Top 8. The Babylonians' math that predicts eclipses. The Babylonians may have been predicting the sky with a level of mathematical precision the ancient world was never supposed to possess. In 1955, researchers revisiting clay tablets from the ruins of Babylon inside the British Museum took a closer look at one object that had long been underestimated. Known as Plimpton 322, the tablet had often been treated as little more than a teaching aid or an administrative exercise. But deeper analysis suggested something far more extraordinary. The numbers inscribed on its surface appeared to encode Pythagorean triples more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras himself. That discovery alone forced historians to reconsider what Babylonian mathematics was capable of. But according to the transcript, this was only the surface of the mystery. Elsewhere in Babylonian records were lunar tables, planetary positions, and eclipse data that pointed to a much larger system, one designed not merely to observe the heavens, but to forecast them. What makes that so unsettling is the level of control implied by the system. The Babylonians tracked the Saros cycle, an 18-year, 11-day, 8-hour pattern that allowed them to predict recurring solar and lunar eclipses. This was not mystical guesswork. It was data accumulated over generations, encoded into their base 60 numerical structure, and applied with astonishing discipline. The same civilization that gave the world 60 minutes in an hour and 60 seconds in a minute may also have developed one of the earliest workable systems for anticipating celestial events with real accuracy. Once that becomes clear, the Babylonians no longer look like priests staring at omens in the sky. They begin to look like analysts, reducing the heavens into a machine of motion, interval, and repetition. And then the story becomes even more difficult to explain away. According to the transcript, one Babylonian tablet described the angular movement of Jupiter across the ecliptic in a way that matched modern measurements within a narrow margin of error. Even more provocative is the suggestion that Babylonian astronomers were using a kind of geometric reasoning that bordered on graphical analysis, centuries before the Renaissance, and without telescopes, calculus, or the formal mathematical language later civilizations would rely on. They observed the sky from mud-brick ziggurats, yet they treated celestial motion as something quantifiable, something that could be mapped, broken into ratios, and projected forward in time. That is the transition that changes everything. Once Babylonian astronomy becomes predictive, it stops looking like early superstition and starts looking like a lost branch of scientific thought. The silence surrounding some of these tablets only deepens the unease. Many remained untranslated until very late. Others were damaged, looted, or scattered through war and private collection. Some pieces reportedly vanished into black market circulation. That pattern matters because the more complete the archive becomes, the harder it is to maintain the old image of ancient astronomy as primitive skywatching. The Babylonians were doing something more systematic than that. They were creating a numerical language for the heavens, one capable of capturing time, repetition, angle, and motion in a way that still echoes through the structure of modern life. So the real mystery may not be whether the Babylonians could predict eclipses. The surviving evidence strongly suggests that they could. The real mystery is how a civilization so ancient developed a mathematical worldview sophisticated enough to model the sky itself, and whether that knowledge was the beginning of science or the remainder of something even older. If Babylon could calculate when darkness would fall across the sun, then what else might they have known about the machinery of the cosmos that history later forgot how to read? Top 9. The Mayans and the Galactic Calendar. The Maya did not just measure time, they seemed to measure it on a scale that made human history look microscopic. In 1966, deep in the jungles of Guatemala, archaeologists excavating the ancient city of Quirigua uncovered a towering stone stela covered in dense glyphs and ceremonial imagery. According to the transcript, the monument recorded a date corresponding to August 13, 3114 BCE, a point far earlier than the Maya themselves were believed to have existed as a civilization. That alone made the inscription extraordinary. It was not simply recounting a king's reign or a local event. It was marking a beginning, the start of a cycle embedded within the Maya long count calendar, a system so vast and precise that it tracked cosmic time across more than 5,000 years. What makes that unsettling is not merely the age of the date, but the scale of thought behind it. The Maya divided time into nested units, days, 20-day periods, larger cycles, and immense chronological structures that extended far beyond any single human life. This was not a calendar built only for planting seasons or ritual holidays. It was a mathematical architecture for tracking celestial recurrence. According to the transcript, the system was precise enough to monitor solar and lunar eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and even larger astronomical rhythms tied to long-term cosmic alignment. Once you understand that, the Maya stop looking like a civilization using time symbolically. They begin to look like a civilization modeling time itself, and then the mystery becomes even harder to contain. The transcript claims that Maya's sacred texts and calendrical systems pointed toward an awareness of the galactic center, the rotational core of the Milky Way, something invisible to the naked eye, and only confirmed through modern scientific instruments much later. Temples such as El Castillo were aligned to solar motion with astonishing care, using light and shadow to embody larger cosmological patterns. On specific dates, shadow forms on the steps created the illusion of a serpent descending, symbolizing a transfer of energy from the heavens into the world below. This is the transition that makes the story far more than a tale of clever calendar making. The Maya were not just tracking days, they were linking architecture, astronomy, ritual, and cosmic cycles into a unified system of meaning. The strongest surviving evidence of that precision lies in the Dresden Codex, one of the few Maya books that escaped destruction. According to the transcript, its eclipse tables and Venus calculations align with modern astronomical data to a stunning degree, with Venus tracking accurate to a tiny margin over a 584-day cycle. Those calculations were not abstract curiosities. They were used to time wars, coronations, ceremonies, and agricultural decisions. In other words, astronomy was not separate from governance. It was woven directly into power, fate, and social order. Then came the detail that modern culture sensationalized and misunderstood. December 21st, 2012. The transcript makes clear that for the Maya, this was not an end-of-the-world prophecy. It marked the completion of a great cycle, tied to a rare alignment involving the winter solstice sun and the dark rift of the Milky Way. That interpretation turns the famous date from apocalypse into transition, a calendrical threshold inside a much larger cosmic pattern. But if the Maya truly encoded such a moment thousands of years in advance, then the question becomes difficult to avoid. How did they know how to frame time on that scale? So if the Maya were not merely keeping a calendar, but mapping civilization against galactic cycles, then what exactly were they preserving? And how much of that knowledge vanished when their codices were burned before we could fully understand them? Top 10. The Chinese Han Dynasty's Earthquake Detector. The ancient world was never supposed to have a machine like this. In the year 132 AD, during the Eastern Han Dynasty, a Chinese polymath named Zhang Heng presented a device to the imperial court that sounded almost impossible for its time. A machine built to detect earthquakes far beyond the horizon. According to the transcript, the instrument was a massive bronze vessel, nearly 6 feet tall, ringed with 8 dragon heads, each holding a bronze ball. Beneath every dragon sat a toad with its mouth open, waiting to catch the falling sphere. The device, identified in the transcript as the Hufeng Didong Yi, was not a symbolic artifact or a piece of court theater. It was designed to sense seismic activity hundreds of miles away, more than 8 centuries before the modern seismograph. That alone would place Zhang Heng far ahead of his age. But what makes this invention so disturbing is that it apparently worked. The transcript describes a mechanism inside the vessel that responded when seismic waves moved through the ground. An internal suspended system, possibly a pendulum or floating mass, would shift, triggering one of the dragon heads to release its bronze ball into the toad below. In a single motion, the machine indicated not only that an earthquake had occurred, but the direction from which it came. One especially striking account says the device once activated, even though no tremor had been felt locally. Days later, messengers reportedly arrived from a region more than 300 miles away, confirming that an earthquake had struck there at exactly the time the instrument responded. That is the transition that changes this from a curious legend into something much more serious. Once the device is treated as functional engineering rather than imperial spectacle, the Han Dynasty begins to look like a civilization experimenting with precision detection systems long before modern instrumentation existed. And the deeper you go, the stranger it becomes. No complete mechanical diagram of the original seismoscope survives. Its internal structure has been lost to time. Yet modern replicas built from Zhang Heng's written descriptions have reportedly succeeded in detecting simulated seismic movement, suggesting that the core principle was sound. The transcript also makes clear that Zhang Heng was far more than a single-purpose inventor. He was an astronomer, engineer, mathematician, and poet. His writings describe the heavens as an immense void with the earth suspended in space, and he treated eclipses as the result of celestial alignment and shadow rather than mythology. Those ideas placed him intellectually ahead of many dominant cosmologies elsewhere in the world. In other words, the seismoscope did not emerge from nowhere. It came from a mind already committed to explaining nature through mechanical and astronomical reasoning. Then comes the familiar pattern seen throughout this entire script: loss, marginalization, and historical fading. After Zhang Heng's death and the weakening of the Han order, many scientific texts disappeared, and the seismoscope drifted from recognized engineering into legend. Later dynasties emphasized spiritual readings of natural disaster. Western readers who later encountered references to the device reportedly dismissed it as folklore. Even today, the invention is often treated as a fascinating footnote rather than what it may truly represent. A rupture in the accepted timeline of ancient technological capability. So if Zhang Heng could build a machine that sensed distant earthquakes using nothing but mechanical principles, then the real mystery is no longer whether ancient China produced extraordinary inventors. The real mystery is how much early scientific knowledge vanished simply because later history chose not to carry it forward, and what else may have been lost along with it. These 10 civilizations were separated by oceans, languages, and entire ages of history. And yet somehow, again and again, they arrived at knowledge that feels deeply out of place. They tracked invisible stars, predicted eclipses, manipulated magnetic stone, encoded information without writing, mastered water in the desert, performed surgical procedures on the skull, and built machines that could sense the movement of the earth itself. Taken one by one, each case can be dismissed as an anomaly, but taken together, they begin to look like something far more unsettling, a pattern. Maybe that pattern tells us that history is not a straight line of progress, but a cycle of discovery, loss, and forgetting. Maybe some of the greatest knowledge ever held by human hands did not survive because it was too fragile, too inconvenient, or too threatening to the systems that came later. Libraries burned, codices were destroyed, translators vanished, traditions were broken, and what remained was only enough to remind us that something larger may once have existed. So the real question is no longer whether these ancient people knew too much for their time. The real question is how much of our past has been filtered, buried, or erased before it ever reached us. And if even a fraction of that lost knowledge is still waiting beneath ruins, deserts, vaults, or untranslated symbols, then history may not be hiding dead civilizations at all. It may be hiding a forgotten version of humanity itself.